Hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar live here from BINA. As you're watching the video, if you haven't yet, don't forget to subscribe by hitting the subscribe button below this video and you will be notified every time that we are live. So, we are in the middle of discussing the 13 principles of faith, the 13 fundamental principles of our religion, upon which the entire Judaism stands. You take them away, Judaism falls to the ground like a building, like a house without a foundation. And we started off with principle 8, being that principle 8 is perhaps one of the most fundamental out of all the fundamentals, and that is the divinity of the Torah. The fact that the Torah that we have today is divine and from God and not man-made. And as we discussed in the past webinars, this includes both the written Torah and the oral Torah, the Torah Shebiksav and the Torah Shebal Peh, both what is written in the Chumash as the written Torah, dictated word for word by God, or derived by our sages, the 13 principles of deriving and interpreting the Torah. All of that is divine. All of that, as the Rambam says clearly, was given on Mount Sinai by God to Moshe Rabbeinu. And as we brought sources last week that are discussed in the Gemara, this very concept that denying the divinity of the entire Torah, including the Torah Shebal Peh, is considered to be heresy. And let's just bring some other sources to sort of hammer home this point, that what the sages, and we have to discuss exactly how this works, but what the sages taught to us in the Talmud wasn't purely based on their own intellect. In fact, the Ramban, Nachmanides, says as follows: from the day the Holy Temple was destroyed, this is a quote from the Talmud in Tractate Baba Basra, page 12a, Daf Yud Beis Amud Aleph. This means that, so the Talmud says like this: from the day that the Holy Temple was destroyed, prophecy was taken from the prophets, but not from the sages. Says the Ramban, says Nachmanides. This means that while the phenomenon of visual prophecy was now withheld from the prophets, the sages were nevertheless privy to a form of intellectual prophecy. They knew the truth through divine inspiration. So says the Ramban in his commentary to Tractate Baba Basra. The Ramban, one of the greatest sages. In other words, what the sages of the Talmud, this is what we're referring to very specifically, the sages of the Talmud taught to us was in a way prophetic. Now we have to understand how that works because we're going to bring a counterpoint in a second to this. But this is what the commentaries say. The Ritva says, in other words, the sages knew intellectually things that the ordinary intellect is not capable of grasping. That's an interesting statement. So they knew intellectual things, but what the regular intellectual person cannot grasp. So it is intellectual, but it's not intellectual. We have to discuss exactly how that works. The Zohar, the Holy Zohar, tells us the sages of the Mishnah and Talmud based all their words on mystical secrets, not purely on their own intellect. Says the Ravid, whose name was Avram ben David, who lived in the 12th century, says as follows: in our house of study, this is already after, post-Talmudic times, he says, in our house of study, divine inspiration has already been flowing for a number of years. And we have decided that the law is, and he goes on to say, a law. In other words, what comes out from all of these sources is when we discussed sages of the Talmud, including the early sages after the Talmud, known as the Rishonim, the earliest commentaries, the Rambam, Rashi, the Ritva, the Ravid, all of these holy great sages, their words are not purely intellectual. Their words are in fact based on prophecy, on divine inspiration. It is divine. On the other hand, it seems to be called intellect. And now let me bring a counterpoint to all of this, sort of make us confused. Why not? The Talmud tells us the following story. The Talmud says that there was a dispute between Rabbi Eliezer, a great sage, Rabbi Eliezer, and the rest of the sages about a certain oven if it was pure or impure. And Rabbi Eliezer had his opinion. And he said, on that day, Rabbi Eliezer told them all the proofs in the world, but the sages did not accept them. The sages did not agree with them. Said Rabbi Eliezer, Omar Lahem, Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the law is as I say, then the carob tree will prove it. And the carob tree miraculously jumped 100 cubits. That's like 50 meters. A tree picked itself up and jumped. A miracle to prove that he was right. Says the sages said to him, you can't prove anything from a carob tree. We're not accepting that as law. Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halacha, if the law is like me, let the stream of water prove it. And the stream of water, the current suddenly changed and started going the other direction. They said, no, not a good proof. He said, if I am right, says Rabbi Eliezer, let the walls of the Beis Medrash fall down. The walls of the house of study fall down. And they actually started to shake. And Rabbi Yoshua, his contemporary, another great sage, told the walls of the Beis Medrash, what are you doing? Who are you to decide what the law is like? And the walls were tipping, but for the honor of Rabbi Yoshua, they stopped falling. Says Rabbi Eliezer, if the law is like me, let a voice from heaven come down and prove that I'm right. And that's exactly what happened. A heavenly voice came out, so to speak, from God himself. And he said, what do you want from Rabbi Eliezer? The law is always like him. Rabbi Yeshua got up on his feet and said, we're not accepting that, because he said the famous phrase, Torah loy bashamayim hi. That's what the Torah says. The Torah says the Torah is not in heaven. What does it mean it's not from heaven? Of course Torah is in heaven. Torah was given to us by God. What does it mean, says the Gemara? It means that we don't listen to a bas koil. We don't listen to heavenly voices to rule a matter of law. Because it says already, God already told us, you go after the majority. Going after the majority means, what's the explanation of this Gemara? Well, going after the majority means that each sage has to think about the law, how they understand it intellectually, and the majority opinion, that is the law. Who cares what the Bas Koil says? The Torah itself tells us that we have to go according to the majority opinion, according to the way they understand. And the story has an interesting ending. We'll just finish off with it. What happened was Rabbi Nosson, another great sage, was part of this discussion, met Eliyahu Hanavi, met Elijah the prophet, which a lot of the sages had this happen to them. They meet Elijah the prophet. Elijah the prophet is somebody who never passed away. He comes back down and he speaks to great people. And he meets Elijah the prophet, and he asks Elijah the prophet, what was God doing at this time of the story? And Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, tells Rabbi Nosson, Kochayich, God was laughing. Va'omar, and he said, Nitzchuni bonai, nitzchuni bonai. My children have won over me, my children have won over me. In other words, a heavenly voice came and said one way, but we rule the law a different way. Obviously, that's what God wants. God wants us to rule according to the way we understand. But what comes out of this Gemara? What comes out of this Gemara is that we don't rule law based on prophecy. Law, Torah Shebal Peh, the system is that each sage needs to think. They need to think intellectually. So how does that work? And the Rambam says you should know that prophecy is ineffective as a mean of explaining the Torah or for deriving additional laws to the 13 principles of Torah interpretation. Whatever methods of analysis and reasoning were used by the prophets, Yeshua and Pinchas, were exactly the same as those used by the Talmudic sages Ravina and Rav Ashi. In other words, it didn't make a difference. You were a prophet, you used the method of interpretation. You were Ravina, Rav Ashi, you were the last few sages of the Talmudic times who put together the Talmud. They used the same system. In other words, they used their minds. So what are you telling me? How does that fit then with all the other sources we brought before, that everything that the sages said is all divine and based on Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration and prophecy? How do these two things fit together? So it's explained the following. This is explained in a book called Lekutei Levi Yitzchak, written by Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson, who was the Rebbe's father, who was not a Rebbe, but he was a great Kabbalist. And he wrote a book called Lekutei Levi Yitzchak, and he explains the following idea. He says Let's first of all put down the premise. And I think this is a very fundamental idea to know in general whenever we study Torah. Whenever we study Torah of the sages of old. He says, don't think to yourself that the sages of the Talmud, of the Mishnah, and the other great Rishonim, the other great early commentators, don't think to yourself that their learning is like just an intellectual thinking. It's like just they're thinking it's like a regular intellectual exercise, he says. He says it's not that way. And what's his proof? He says we have a rule like this. We know that the sages of the Talmud never argue with the sages of the Mishnah. The sages that come after and this is especially true with the sages that come after the Talmud. Once the Talmud, is what the Rambam says, once the Talmud is finished, no one can argue with the law in the Talmud. No one can come and say that the Talmud, the sages of the Talmud understood this one way, the sages afterwards understood it a different way. We argue with the sages of the Talmud. You can't do that. That's not the way Jewish law works. The Rambam says that clearly. We cannot ever change any halachas that were put together in the Talmud. The question is why? They were smart people, I'm sure, but there was never another person since the time of the Talmud who arose with the same intellectual capacity as the sages of the Talmud? What? They were suddenly, as soon as the Talmud finished, okay, no more smart people in the world, no more geniuses in the world. If it's purely intellectual, if it's purely based on human intellect, so why can't we argue with the Talmud? Maybe today you have a genius who's as smart as Abaye and Rava, two sages in the Talmud. How do you know? And the answer is because it's not purely an intellectual exercise. It's a beautiful proof. It's an amazing proof. It's not purely an intellectual exercise. It's based on divine inspiration. And those people were not only smarter than us. That's not the point. The point is they were holier than us. They had greater divine inspiration, and therefore what they set down the law, the halakha, that wasn't just based on a purely intellectual exercise. It was based on Ruach HaKodesh and divine inspiration. And therefore, we can't argue with them. It has nothing to do with how smart we are. It has to do with how holy we are. How privy we are to that divine inspiration. We don't have it, and therefore we can't argue with them. That's a very important point when it comes to the development of halacha. We can never argue with the sages of the Talmud. That just doesn't work like that in Jewish law. Once the Talmud is finished, that's the law. Says the Lekutei Levi Yitzchak, how does that fit with what the Rambam says, that you can't rule a halacha based on divine inspiration? How does that fit? The answer is because they thought about it. In other words, it was revealed to them through divine inspiration, but they couldn't rule the law based on that. They had to then take that inspiration and bring it down into intellect. They had to think about it, and they had to come to an intellectual conclusion that that is indeed the case. So in other words, it's based on divine inspiration, but it's ruled because their intellect says so. True, Torah lo b'shamayim, you cannot rule a halach. The way, so a heavenly voice came out, but their intellect said otherwise, and halacha needs to be ruled based on logic, based on the way the rabbis, the sages understand it. However, it didn't start from their understanding. It came to them through divine inspiration. Then they worked very hard to understand it that way, to truly understand it that way in an intellectual way. And then they ruled the law. Because you can't rule it purely based on prophecy. And that's what it means, Torah lo b'shamayim hi. And then he ends off and he says very beautiful words. I just want to read this to you because it's very, very powerful. He says there is absolutely no doubt that everything which is stated in the written law and the oral law, both in the legal passages and the more academic passages, in all the works composed by the saints and scholars who studied Torah for its own sake, in other words, who studied what's called Torah Lishma, who learned Torah the right way, and even those rulings which the Talmud states were an error. Sometimes the Talmud brings a ruling in the name of somebody, and the Talmud says it's wrong. Even that, all of them were said by God. Literally in the very same words which are recorded today. God himself said the law, and then God himself said it was an error. Likewise, all the questions posed in the Talmud that were left unresolved, and all the arguments that were refuted, were all said by God. In other words, what's the Talmud? Another way of saying what he just said. The Talmud is God's thought process. Yes, it was developed by human beings. Of course it was developed by human beings. Of course it was through the sages that using their own minds and thinking. But they were divinely inspired people, that their minds led them to the correct conclusion. Obviously because they used the system which was God-given, number one. They were godly people, they were holy people. They weren't just smarter than us. They were holier than us. And therefore they were filled with divine inspiration that their minds led them to the right conclusion. And therefore when we open up a Talmud, we open up a Gemara, we have to know what we're doing. We're learning through God's thought process, so to speak. God's thought process includes questions. Includes when God says this and then he says, no, that's incorrect. And when he refutes something, all of that is, so to speak, the back and forth within God's mind. That's what it means that Torah is divine. Everything in Torah is divine. Now, what we need to understand is how does that work together with the fact that there are disputes. First of all, how do disputes develop? Number one, if everything is from God, so there should only be one way of understanding everything. And number two, how can you say that God thinks two opposite things? How can you say both opinions are divine? So that still needs to be explained. But the basis of all of this is what the Rambam says. A lot of the explanation over here doesn't come from the Gimel Ikrin, but it's all based on the foundation that the Rambam sets down, that everything in Torah is divine, both the written Torah and the oral law. The written Torah is divine, dictated word for word by God. The oral law is divine in a different way, meaning it's all from God, it just came through the intellect of the sages and in a way that they understood it on an intellectual level, not only on prophecy. That needs to still be explained a little bit more, that last point, the difference between the written Torah and the oral law. But the bottom line is that they're both divine, they're both from God, and we open up a Talmud, it's God's thought process, so to speak. Hopefully this will give us a new appreciation of what it means to learn Torah, what it means to learn the words of the sages. Have a wonderful day.